I
In
told
a
you never
modest
to come
diner,
back here.
an elderly man sat in solitude, his body
Just hear me
trembling,
out.
yet his spirit unbroken. Minutes later, a violent hand
wanted
struck
to see
across
me.
his weathered face, casting the entire room into stunned silence.
Yes, have
No
a
one
seat.
stirred, no one uttered a word. However, 1 hour afterward, the entrance door burst open and the oppressive quiet shattered. As his son entered accompanied by Hell's Angels. Before we commence, please share in the comments where you're viewing from and subscribe to our channel. Each comment, donation, and membership you provide helps us deliver more meaningful stories to enrich your lives. Dawn had scarcely broken over Ashfield, a modest town where life moved at a gentler pace than the bustling world beyond. Within a corner diner, Earl Whitman, aged 80, occupied his customary booth beside the window. Earl was far more than just another elderly patron. He was a war veteran who had witnessed horrors beyond most people's comprehension. His hands trembled faintly as he raised his coffee cup, yet his eyes, brilliant blue and penetrating, retained their quiet fortitude. Regular customers recognized him and offered respectful nods, though few truly understood his history. To the majority, he was simply the gentleman who requested black coffee and toast each morning. Yet beneath those weathered creases on his face lay memories of warfare, of fallen comrades, and sacrifices that no one in that diner could ever comprehend. That particular morning seemed identical to countless others, filled with the aroma of sizzling bacon and eggs, the cheerful chatter of waitresses, and the gentle hum of an aged jukebox, until the bell above the entrance chimed and a completely different energy invaded the space. The man who stepped inside clearly didn't belong in Ashfield's humble diner. He appeared younger, in his mid-30s, with a leather jacket casually draped across his shoulder. Urge and rage weighing heavily in his movement. His boots struck the tiled floor with harsh echoes, as though each step issued a challenge. His name was Trevor Cole, though no one inquired and no one dared to ask. He surveyed the room, his sneer radiating with conceit. Several patrons averted their gaze, hoping to avoid drawing his notice. He brought with him the type of presence that invited conflict. He didn't settle quietly like the others. Instead, he threw himself into a booth, barked demands for coffee, and drummed his fist against the table with impatience. His voice was coarse and grating, the kind that dominated a room even during his silence. Earl observed him, but remained silent. He had lived long enough to recognize approaching storms. Yet the tempest was nearer than anyone suspected, and it was about to unleash its fury directly upon Earl. Earl sat peacefully, spreading butter on his toast with slow, methodical movements. Trevor continued glaring across the dining area, as if hunting for prey. The waitress, anxious yet courteous, attempted to maintain her composure as she delivered his coffee. Trevor sneered at the cup. "Is this the best you people can produce? Liquid mud." His tone dripped with disdain. Patrons shifted uneasily in their seats, pretending not to listen, though everyone's attention was captured. Earl, who had always maintained faith in showing respect, even toward strangers, elevated his voice just enough to be audible. "Young man, there's no need to address her in such a manner. She's simply performing her duties." The diner fell completely still. Trevor slowly rotated his head toward Earl, his sneer transforming into something malicious. "What did you just say, old man?" Earl didn't waver. His hands remained calmly positioned on the table. "I said, show kindness. It costs you nothing." For a brief moment, silence gripped the room. Then tea. Trevor rose to his feet. Trevor approached Earl's booth with deliberate steps. Each movement was calculated, savoring the fear ascending within the diner. Earl remained motionless, didn't even blink. When Trevor reached the booth, he leaned in close, his voice dripping with mockery. "Kindness? What would an ancient relic like you understand about kindness?" Without warning, his hand struck out. A sharp crack filled the air as Trevor's palm connected with Earl's cheek. The sound silenced everything, the clatter of dishware, the hum of the jukebox, even the waitress's nervous breathing. Earl's face turned slightly from the impact, but his eyes never departed from Trevor's. No rage, no terror, just a calm, quiet dignity. Trevor smirked, satisfied with his display. "That's what kindness earns you," he spat, straightening himself and scanning the diner, challenging anyone to confront him. No one moved, no one spoke. The room froze in shame and helplessness. Earl slowly pressed a napkin to the corner of his mouth. His voice was gentle, yet unwavering. "You don't understand what real battles are, son." The diner remained locked in oppressive silence. Trevor strutted back to his booth, proud of his performance, sipping his coffee like a man who had just claimed dominion. However, the customers couldn't meet each other's eyes. Shame hung in the atmosphere, not only for Trevor's cruelty, but for their own silence. Earl sat with his toast remaining untouched, his hand now trembling slightly. He didn't weep. He didn't shout. He simply sat, shoulders straight, as if bearing years of memories that only he could carry. The waitress, her eyes moist, whispered, "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Whitman." Earl offered her the faintest smile, a smile that conveyed both forgiveness and sorrow. "It's not your fault, dear." Trevor laughed loudly, forcing the room to remain under his control. See, the old man understands his place. He believed the moment belonged to him. What he didn't realize was that time had its own method of balancing the scales. Earl sat still, but within him, memories stirred, like restless spirits. He recalled being 18, crouched in muddy trenches far from home, with dirt in his boots and fear in his chest. He remembered brothers who never returned, men who had sacrificed everything for one another. And he remembered why he had survived, because someone had taught him that courage wasn't about violence or noise. It was about standing tall when the world attempted to break you. Earl didn't concern himself with the slap. His body was aged, and pain was no stranger. What wounded him deeper was the silence in the diner, the way everyone pretended nothing had occurred, the way no one defended dignity. He didn't despise them, he understood. Fear carries weight. Silence can silence the strongest voices. Still, he whispered a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for the stranger who carried such darkness in his heart. Trevor smirked across the room, believing the conflict was concluded. But Earl knew that battles often end differently than they begin. At a booth near the back, a young man in his 20s shifted uncomfortably. He wore a baseball cap pulled low, concealing his eyes. He wanted to stand, to say something, but fear chained him to his seat. He looked at Earl, feeling ashamed, then back at Trevor, whose laughter filled the space. The waitress, trembling, poured another cup of coffee, her hands shaking so severely that some spilled onto the counter. She bit her lip, glancing at Earl, silently pleading for forgiveness. Earl caught her eye and gave the smallest nod, as if to say, "It's all right." That nod ignited a spark in the young man's chest. But before he could rise, Trevor slammed his hand on the table again. "Nobody has anything to say? That's what I thought." His grin widened, feeding on the silence. Outside, the sound of a motorcycle engine faintly echoed in the distance. No one noticed yet, but soon that sound would grow louder. And with it, everything inside the diner would transform. Time crawled in that diner. Every tick of the old wall clock sounded louder, heavier, like a countdown. Earl sipped his cooling coffee, the taste bitter but grounding. Trevor stretched out in his booth, arms spread wide like a monarch surveying his realm. Customers shifted nervously, eyes darting toward the door, hoping someone might enter, someone who could stand where they could not. Earl thought of his son, Caleb. He hadn't seen him in weeks. Caleb worked long hours as a mechanic in the city, his life rough around the edges but filled with loyalty and determination. Earl had raised him to respect others, to fight only when necessary. But he also knew Caleb carried a fire within him, a fire that once ignited could not easily be extinguished. Earl whispered his son's name under his breath, more a prayer than a hope. Caleb wasn't present. Not yet. But outside, that faint motorcycle rumble grew closer. A storm was approaching the diner. Trevor, restless, stood again and looked directly at Earl. "You know what your problem is, old man. You believe respect matters, but respect is weakness." His words dripped venom, his grin daring anyone to argue. Earl held his gaze, his voice steady. "Respect is the only strength that endures." Trevor laughed, sharp and cruel. He looked around the diner, his eyes locking on the young man in the baseball cap. "What about you, kid? Want to play hero? Stand up and I'll knock you down twice as hard." The young man froze, shame washing over him, and Trevor smirked triumphantly. He turned back to Earl, towering over him. "You think you're tough? Tell me, what does toughness look like now?" Earl's silence was his answer, not weakness, but defiance. Trevor leaned closer, whispering, "You have no one left to fight for you." Just then, the roar of multiple motorcycle engines thundered outside. Trevor's smirk faltered just slightly. The clock struck noon, and the storm entered. The sound shook the glass windows, deep, growling engines that made the diner vibrate. Every head turned toward the door as it swung open. The atmosphere changed instantly. Leather jackets, heavy boots, and the unmistakable presence of men who carried themselves with unshakable authority. At their center was Caleb Whitman, Earl's son. Broad-shouldered with grease still under his fingernails, Caleb walked with the calm stride of someone who didn't need to prove anything. Around him were members of the Hells Angels, their patches bold, their presence undeniable. The diner inhaled as one, the silence thick with awe and fear. Caleb's eyes found his father immediately. He saw the red mark on Earl's cheek, his jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists. Without a word, Caleb walked across the room, every boot step echoing like a drumbeat. Trevor leaned back, suddenly less certain. The balance of power shifted in an instant, and for the first time that morning, Trevor's grin began to fade. Caleb reached his father's booth and dropped to one knee beside him. He didn't speak at first. He just looked into Earl's eyes. Earl's calm gaze met his son's fiery one, and in that silent exchange, more was communicated than words could carry. Caleb's voice finally broke the silence, low and rough. "Who did this?" Earl, steady as ever, placed a hand gently on his son's arm. "It's all right, Caleb, let it be." But Caleb's eyes lifted, finding Trevor across the diner. The Hells Angels stood behind him like shadows, their presence filling every corner. Trevor shifted in his seat, his arrogance now tinged with unease. He tried to smirk, but it wavered. Caleb stood, his voice carrying weight. "Stand up." The room tensed. The young man beneath the baseball cap leaned forward, holding his breath. Trevor's hand trembled nervously against the table sit. Face. The quiet wasn't born of fear anymore. It had become anticipation. Everyone waited to see what would unfold next. Trevor paused. For the first time, he appeared diminished, but pride, that treacherous driving force, compelled him to rise. He stood gradually, attempting to control his breathing, trying to conceal his trembling hands. Caleb remained motionless. Not yet. His voice maintained its composure, almost unnaturally calm. "You think it makes you strong to strike an elderly man?" Trevor manufactured a laugh. He deserved it. Caleb's expression grew darker. "That's my father." The declaration hit with more force than any physical blow. The Hells Angels shifted subtly, their bodies tilting forward, silent yet prepared. The entire restaurant held its breath, fearful that even the sound of a coffee cup might break the fragile moment. Trevor inflated his chest, attempting to recover the swagger that was slipping away from him. "What? You going to teach me a lesson with your gang?" Caleb shook his head deliberately. "I don't need them to handle you." The room became motionless. This wasn't about numbers. It was about justice. Earl's hand extended, grasping Caleb's wrist with unexpected force. "Son," he said with authority, his voice slicing through the tension. "Don't." Caleb gazed down, caught between fury and reverence. Earl's voice grew gentler, yet bore the gravity of years. "This isn't your battle. This is his burden, not yours." Caleb tightened his jaw, wrestling against the tempest within him. The Hells Angels observed quietly, bound by allegiance, but honoring the father's wishes. Trevor spotted an opportunity, sneering once more. "That's right, hide behind Daddy's wisdom." But Earl's gaze fixed on him, piercing and unwavering. "You confuse restraint with weakness. That's your greatest failing." Trevor's sneer wavered again. The room's atmosphere transformed, not due to violence, but because of something far more powerful, dignity. Caleb released his breath, his fists relaxing, though his frame still trembled with contained energy. The young man in the baseball cap swallowed with difficulty, realizing he was witnessing not merely strength, but heritage, the transfer of wisdom from father to son. The silence in the restaurant grew more oppressive, pressing against every surface. Trevor attempted to laugh, but it sounded empty now, like a man trying to persuade himself. Caleb remained steady, unmoving, allowing the silence to burden Trevor's conscience. The waitress, her hands still shaking, finally found her voice, though it cracked. "Why don't you just leave?" Trevor whirled around, glaring at her, but the bravery in her eyes halted him. One by one, other patrons raised their gaze, no longer cowering. The young man in the baseball cap sat straighter in his seat. A couple in the corner, who had kept their faces down, nodded slowly. For the first time, Trevor wasn't confronting one man or even a gang. He was facing a room filled with silent defiance. Earl's words had taken hold. Respect was rising like a flood. Trevor's arrogance fractured under the pressure. His fists clenched, but his assurance had vanished. He was no longer commanding the situation, and he realized it. Trevor's breathing accelerated. He surveyed the room, desperate for the dominance he had possessed only moments before. But now every set of eyes penetrated him, not with terror, but with condemnation. His shoulders drooped slightly, though he attempted to mask it with another sneer. Caleb moved forward just once, reducing the distance by a single step. That step carried the significance of everything: the motorcycles outside, the Hells Angels behind him, and the lineage of a man who had survived combat. Trevor's sneer faltered. He tried to speak, but his throat constricted. This doesn't mean anything," he mumbled, but the words lacked conviction. Earl spoke again, voice composed but authoritative. "It means everything. It means your fists don't govern here. Respect does." Trevor looked at Earl, truly observed him, and saw not just an elderly man, but someone unbroken, someone more powerful than he could ever become. For the first time, Trevor's eyes dropped, and that was his surrender. The restaurant's door seemed more distant than it was, but Trevor finally moved toward it. His steps dragged, no longer crisp and authoritative. The room remained silent, watching. Each face that had once turned away now stared directly at him, without fear. The waitress stood proudly, her shoulders squared. The young man in the baseball cap removed it, revealing his eyes at last, steady and resolute. Trevor's boots scraped against the floor, his swagger vanished. He pushed open the door, the bell above it chiming feebly. Outside, the thunder of motorcycles awaited, a barrier of sound reminding him of what he had forfeited. He didn't glance back. He couldn't. The restaurant exhaled as one, the thick air finally releasing. Earl sipped his lukewarm coffee, finally placing the cup down. Caleb sat opposite him, his fists still rigid, but his eyes softening as he regarded his father. Respect had been upheld not through violence, but through dignity, and the teaching remained. Caleb leaned forward, his voice hushed, almost fracturing. "I should have." Earl interrupted gently. "No, son, you did exactly what was necessary. You stood, and sometimes standing doesn't require striking, sometimes it means holding back." Caleb's jaw quivered. He had always believed strength meant action, but observing his father, weathered yet unbroken, he grasped something deeper. The Hells Angels, men Reno, wend for toughness, stood quietly, their respect for Earl carved into their expressions. Even they acknowledged the power of restraint. Caleb nodded slowly, his chest easing, the fire inside settling into something more stable. "I understand now," he whispered. Earl smiled faintly. "Good, because the world doesn't need more fists, it needs more hearts." The young man in the baseball cap finally rose, approached Earl's booth, and said softly, "Thank you, sir." His voice trembled, but courage resided within it. Earl nodded. Courage was infectious, and it had finally permeated the room. The restaurant slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed, hesitant at first, then warmer. The jukebox hummed again, filling the silence with gentle music. Plates clinked, coffee flowed, and the air felt lighter, almost sacred. The waitress placed a fresh cup of coffee before Earl, her hands now steady. "On the house," she said with a smile. Earl thanked her, lifting it carefully, savoring the warmth. Caleb leaned back, observing his father with new understanding, not just as a parent, but as a man who carried an unshakable truth. The Hells Angels quietly occupied the booths around them, their laughter subdued but respectful, like guardians at rest. The young man in the baseball cap sat taller now, confidence flickering within him like a new flame. The restaurant wasn't merely a place for breakfast anymore. It had become a place where silence had been shattered, where dignity had remained firm, and where a lesson had been planted in every soul present. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, Earl turned to his son. "Caleb," he said softly, "a man's true strength isn't measured by how forcefully he strikes. It's measured by what he defends." Caleb swallowed, the words penetrating deeply within him. He looked at his father, the red mark still visible on his cheek, and felt both pride and sadness. Pride because his father had stood tall. Sadness because the world was often harsh to men who carried such dignity. Earl reached across the table, his weathered hand gripping Caleb's firmly. "Promise me, son, when the world pushes you, don't simply push back. Stand taller. That's how you'll honor me." Caleb's eyes grew misty, but he nodded firmly. "I promise, Dad." The jukebox played a gentle melody, almost like a hymn. Outside, the motorcycles rumbled again, ready to depart. Inside, an old soldier passed down the final truth of his battles. When Earl finally stood, the restaurant rose with him, not from obligation, but respect. He tipped his cap politely to the waitress, smiled at the young man in the baseball cap, and patted his son's shoulder. Together, they walked to the door. The Hells Angels fell in step behind Caleb like silent protectors. As they departed, sunlight spilled across the restaurant floor, brighter than before. The customers sat in silence again, not from fear, but reflection. They had witnessed something rare, not fists against fists, but dignity against arrogance. Outside, Earl lifted his face to the breeze, the roar of motorcycles surrounding him like an anthem. He closed his eyes, whispering words no one else could hear. "Respect always wins." Caleb looked at his father, not as a fragile old man, but as the strongest man he had ever known. The road stretched ahead, endless and alive, and together they walked into the light. In a world that often confuses power with cruelty, Earl reminded us all that true strength is found in respect. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and press the bell icon for more heartfelt stories.